Hi everybody. Sometimes when we're analysing data, we want to use methods that have multiple parameter types. For example, with occupancy modelling or mark-recapture analyses. And each of these parameter types might be affected by different predictive variables or covariates. And as an analyst, we often want to go through and identify what are the important covariates for either some of those parameter types or all of them. And so it becomes a model selection problem that we need to focus on individual parameter types one at a time. And when we're doing that, it's important to keep in mind that even if we're focusing on one particular parameter, what we do and what we define for the other parameter types in the model can have an effect on our overall results. And one situation I've seen when people are doing this is that for those parameter types that they're not focusing on, they set them to be a very simple model. That they maybe make it constant, so there's actually no variation in that parameter type. So for example, suppose in occupancy modelling, with a single season occupancy model, we have two parameter types. We have one parameter that we call psi for modelling occupancy. And then we have a second parameter for detection, which we usually denote as P. Well, at least I do. And so if we think perhaps that there might be some covariates that affect occupancy, let's call them just say X and Y. And we might also have some variables that we think are important for detection. Let's call them, say, maybe Y is also affecting detection as well, but possibly also, say, Z or Z if you're from the Americas. If we're trying to look at what factors are important for occupancy, what some people sometimes do is say, okay, let's look at detection and let's identify what variables are important for detection first, because that's our nuisance parameter. But while we're doing that, to keep things simple, we're just going to keep occupancy constant. Okay, so we're not going to include any of these variables in our analysis while we're focusing on detection probability. And so when people do that, when they make one parameter constant, that's actually a really, really big assumption. That's actually a very restrictive assumption. Because if there's actually some variation in that parameter, either due to perhaps the variables that you're considering, or maybe also related to the variables that you're thinking about for the other parameter type. So if there's actually variation in that parameter you're not focusing on, but you're forcing it to be constant, that's a really, really big assumption. And if there is actually variation in the data with respect to that parameter, the only place the model can express that variation in the data is through that parameter you are focusing on, where you are allowing some predictive variables to be in there. And so that variation in the data that's due to one parameter type might be inappropriately pushed through to the other parameter type and lead to some misleading inferences. Now the reason for that is that with things like occupancy modelling and mark-recapture analyses, we don't tend to have a random error term that just allows for unexplained variation in the data. And so if we have a dot model or a constant model for these other parameter types, that's actually a really big assumption and is a very strict assumption, because we're saying there is no other variation in that parameter type that we're not focusing on. So my suggestion is that when we're in these model selection problems where we have these multiple parameter types, then for those parameters that we're not focusing on, we still want to keep a fairly general model for those parameters by including a number of different covariates that we think potentially might be important for that parameter. Because then if there is some variation in the data that's related to those parameter types, the model has the flexibility to express that in the correct location, rather than perhaps that variation in the data being pushed through to another parameter type. Because we have to remember that these parameters aren't typically independent of one another. The information is kind of linked together, and so what we do with one parameter type and the assumptions we make with one parameter type can have the effect on the other parameter types. So that's my suggestion, is when we're in this situation with these multiple parameter types and we're doing these model selection, we don't want to use a constant model for our sort of nuisance parameters or the parameters that we're not focusing on. We want to give those other parameter types a bit of variation by including some covariates in there to allow that variation to be expressed to some degree if we can. And even better is to include perhaps a random error term on those sort of nuisance parameters to give the model as much flexibility as possible while we're focusing on other parameter types. So there you have it. Hope you found that useful. Until next time, see you later.